The USS Arleigh Burke had been silent for months. Her massive engines sat cold, her radar dark, her decks echoing with the sound of nothing but gulls. She wasn't just a warship, she was a symbol of power, of protection. But now she was a ghost in the harbor. The Navy's best engineers had tried. Parts were replaced. Diagnostics run. Hours turned into weeks, then months. The destroyer that had once cut through storms and carried sailors safely home now couldn't even power her own lights. Then, one gray morning, an old man walked down the pier. He wore a faded ball cap with a ship's crest, his steps slow but sure. His name was barely known to the crew, just a retired machinist, 85 years old, who'd served when ships were still built by hands, not computers. They told him the Burke was beyond saving. He just smiled and said, "She's only sleeping." What happened over the next 48 hours would become one of the most talked about veteran stories in the fleet. A tale of unsung heroes, battlefield courage in peacetime, and the moment a forgotten sailor brought a giant back to life. The morning fog clung low over the harbor, wrapping the USS Arleigh Burke in a shroud of pale gray. From a distance, the destroyer still looked every bit the fearsome warship she had once been. Towering radar masts, sleek lines, a hull that had weathered storms halfway around the world. But up close, the silence was almost unsettling. No hum of auxiliary power. No steady thrum of life deep in the engine rooms. She was a proud giant, adrift in her own stillness. For the crew stationed nearby, the Burke's condition was more than just a technical problem. It was an embarrassment. She was supposed to be a symbol of readiness, part of America's shield. Instead, she sat tied to the pier, a reminder that even the strongest machines can fall silent. Engineers had worked day and night for months, crawling through cramped machinery spaces, checking miles of wiring, replacing parts worth more than some houses. Nothing worked. The Navy had begun discussing stripping her for parts, quietly admitting defeat. It was on one of those quiet mornings that someone noticed him. An old man, walking slowly down the pier, his worn jacket zipped tight against the cold. His cap bore the crest of an older destroyer, the USS Hainsworth, a name that most of the younger sailors didn't even recognize. He carried no toolbox, no clipboard, just a battered canvas satchel and the kind of steady gaze that belonged to someone who'd seen decades of oceans and steel. The petty officer on watch straightened as he approached. "Sir, this is a restricted area," the sailor began, expecting the man to turn back. But instead, the old veteran stopped, his eyes moving from the bow to the stern, taking in every line, every detail of the Arleigh Burke. "She's a good ship," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's just not talking to you right now." The sailor frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, the best engineers in the Navy couldn't get her to start." The man looked at him with a faint smile. "That's because she doesn't need engineers right now. She needs a sailor." Word traveled quickly through the small detachment on the pier. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and before long, a lieutenant came down to meet him. The officer was young, sharp uniform, polished shoes, the kind of confidence that came from academy training. "I'm told you think you can fix my ship," the lieutenant said flatly. The veteran's reply was calm. "I don't think. I know." The lieutenant glanced at the satchel in his hand. "With that?" The old man's smile didn't fade. "Everything I've ever needed to keep a destroyer alive is in here." That answer didn't inspire confidence. Not in the young officer, anyway. But the captain of the Arleigh Burke had been watching from the bridge, curious about the man who walked the pier like he'd been here before. When the veteran mentioned his name, Chief Machinist's mate Samuel Carter, retired, something in the captain's eyes changed. "Let him aboard," the captain ordered. And just like that, the course of the next 48 hours was set in motion. Carter stepped onto the deck like a man greeting an old friend. He ran his hand along the cool steel, not with the detached professionalism of an inspector, but with the reverence of someone who understood what this ship meant, not just as a weapon, but as a home to the sailors who served on her. This wasn't just a piece of machinery to him. This was a living, breathing thing. Below decks, the smell of oil and metal greeted him like an old memory. He descended into the heart of the Burke, where the great turbines sat cold and silent. Engineers had poked and prodded at these machines for months, reading numbers off screens, consulting digital manuals. Carter didn't ask for a manual. He didn't ask for a schematic. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, as if the silence itself could tell him what was wrong. The younger sailors watched from the shadows, some amused, some skeptical. To them, he was just another one of those forgotten heroes, men whose stories belonged in history books, not in the present. They didn't yet understand that this was a man whose battlefield courage hadn't been forged in a computer lab, but in engine rooms under fire, when keeping the ship alive meant keeping hundreds of shipmates alive. He knelt beside one of the main turbines, running his hands along the casing, feeling for vibrations that shouldn't be there. Then, with the slow care of a surgeon, he opened his satchel. Inside were tools worn smooth by decades of use, not shiny and new, but precise, each one with its own history. "Power her up," he told the crew. The lieutenant frowned. "Sir, we've already tried." "Power her up." Reluctantly, they followed his order. The deep rumble of auxiliary systems filled the space, but the main engines stayed stubbornly still. Carter leaned close to the machinery, listening not for the roar of power, but for the whispers of something out of place. Then he tapped one of the fuel lines with the handle of his wrench, listening to the sound it made. "Shut her down," he said. In less than 20 minutes aboard, he had already spotted something no one else had noticed. And though the crew didn't yet know it, Samuel Carter had just taken the first step in waking the sleeping giant. The air in the engine room was heavy, the kind of metallic tang that clung to your lungs long after you left. Chief Machinist's mate Samuel Carter stood there, one hand resting on the cold steel, his head tilted just enough to look like he was listening for something no one else could hear. The lieutenant crossed his arms, impatience clear on his face. "So, what's your diagnosis?" Carter didn't answer right away. He was staring at a section of the fuel line that ran toward the turbine. It looked fine. No visible leaks, no scorch marks, no warping from heat. But Carter's brow furrowed. "I need to see the supply manifold," he finally said. A petty officer guided him through the cramped passageways, ducking under pipes, stepping over thick bundles of cabling. The younger sailors exchanged glances as he passed, some curious, others still smirking. This was their ship, after all, and they had been living with its failure for months. To think an 85-year-old was going to solve it with a bag of worn tools, it felt impossible. When they reached the manifold, Carter crouched low. His knees cracked audibly, he ignored them. His hands traced the lines, stopping at a connection point just before the main valve. "Here," he murmured. The petty officer leaned in, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. "This connection is newer than the rest," Carter said quietly. "Replaced recently." "Yeah. Fuel delivery issue a while back. We swapped the coupling." Carter nodded slowly. "And after that, you started having power irregularities." The petty officer blinked. "Yeah." Carter smiled faintly, though his eyes were serious. "There's your first ghost." He reached into his satchel, pulling out a small inspection mirror with a cracked handle. Angling it carefully, he showed the petty officer a thin, almost invisible gap, a manufacturing defect in the new coupling. It was letting in air, disrupting fuel flow just enough to make the turbines starve intermittently. The computers didn't catch it because the sensors were reading downstream, past the fault. By the time they returned to the engine room, the captain had come down in person. He was tall, calm, and clearly a man who chose his words carefully. "I hear you found something," the captain said. Carter nodded. "I found the start of something. But fixing her won't be about replacing parts. It'll be about listening to her. She's got more to say." The captain studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "You have the deck, Chief. Whatever you need." It wasn't just permission. It was trust. And in the Navy, trust is earned, not given. Over the next 6 hours, Carter moved through the Burke like a man tracing a map burned into his memory. He checked fuel lines, pressure regulators, lubrication systems, electrical connectors. He tightened bolts no one thought to check, cleared out sediment from filter housings, and adjusted alignment on bearings by fractions of a millimeter. The young sailors followed him, at first out of duty, then out of fascination. They asked questions, and Carter answered, not in technical jargon, but in plain, almost poetic terms. "A ship's like a person," he said once, as he tapped lightly on a turbine casing. "You can read her vital signs all day on a screen, but you'll never know what's really wrong until you listen to her heartbeat." That line stuck with them. It was more than emotional storytelling. It was experience forged through decades of keeping ships alive in situations far worse than this. At one point, they stopped for coffee in the mess. A few sailors asked him about his service. Carter didn't brag. He didn't talk about medals or campaigns. Instead, he told them about the time his destroyer took a hit in the South China Sea and lost power in the middle of a storm. The engine room was flooding, the lights flickered, and the captain had given the order to prepare for abandoned ship. "But you didn't abandon her," one sailor said. Carter's voice softened. "No. You don't abandon a ship any more than you abandon a friend. We brought her back, inch by inch. And she brought us home." It was the first moment the crew saw him not as an old man with a wrench, but as one of those real war heroes, a man whose soldier sacrifice wasn't just about facing bullets, but about standing between his shipmates and the cold, unforgiving sea. By the evening of the first day, small but unmistakable changes began to ripple through the Burke systems. The auxiliary generators ran smoother. Pressure readings leveled out. Even the ambient noise in the machinery spaces seemed steadier, as if the ship herself was waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The lieutenant, who had spent most of the day skeptical, finally approached Carter. "I'll admit, I didn't think you'd get this far," he said. Carter didn't gloat. He just gave a small nod. "We're not there yet. She's breathing again, but she hasn't found her voice." That night, Carter stayed aboard. He refused a bunk, choosing instead to nap in the engine room with his jacket rolled up under his head. When the petty officer asked why, Carter's answer was simple. "If she stirs in the night, I want to be here to hear it." By sunrise, the next phase of the work would begin, the one that would push the old machinist and the crew into the kind of test none of them had expected. The next morning, the harbor was still wrapped in cold mist, but inside the Arleigh Burke, the air buzzed with quiet energy. The crew had gathered in the engine room earlier than usual, some holding coffee, others just watching the old machinist at work. Carter's eyes were sharper than his age suggested. He moved with a deliberate pace, checking gauges, feeling the faint vibrations through the soles of his boots. He had spent his life learning that ships talk in ways most people never hear. A shift in pitch, a tremor in the floor, a faint smell of overheating oil. "Today," Carter said, tightening a valve with slow precision, "we see if she wants to come home." The plan was to bring the main turbines online for the first time in months. The captain had cleared the pier for safety, and even shore power was ready to disconnect. But just as Carter signaled to start the ignition sequence, a petty officer's voice broke in sharply over the comm. "Chief, fuel pressure is dropping." Carter's head snapped up. "Hold ignition." The room filled with urgent movement. Sailors rushed to their stations, eyes flicking between gauges and monitors. The pressure continued to fall, not a slow leak, but a rapid, dangerous drop that could damage the turbines if they tried to start them now. "Shut everything down," the captain ordered from the control console. The tension in the room thickened. Some of the younger sailors looked at Carter as if expecting defeat. Instead, he calmly set his wrench on the deck, wiped his hands, and said, "We've got a blockage upstream. And it's not in the lines you've been checking." He moved fast now, his years falling away as he traced the fuel system backward, opening inspection hatches and shining his small flashlight inside. Finally, at a filter housing tucked behind a maze of piping, he stopped. When the housing was opened, the problem became clear, a thick, tar-like sludge clogging the filter element. It wasn't from poor maintenance. It was from the ship sitting idle so long that condensation had built up in the tanks, allowing microbial growth to form. The sensors had never picked it up because the contamination was trapped upstream from their location. It's not just about fixing machines, Carter told the crew as he cleaned the housing himself. It's about knowing where to look when the machines lie to you. By mid-morning, the blockage was cleared. The fuel pressure held steady this time, but the failed start had cost them precious time. The captain looked at Carter. We can try again today, or wait until tomorrow. Carter didn't hesitate. We try again today. A ship that's ready to come back to life shouldn't be told to wait. They ran the ignition sequence again. The room went quiet except for the rising whine of the starters. Everyone held their breath. Then, a cough. A sputter. A deep, shuddering rumble. For the first time in months, the main turbines began to turn. The sound rolled through the deck plates, a deep vibration that made the crew grin despite themselves. But it didn't last. Just seconds into the rotation, an alarm blared. Overheat warning. Bearing temperature climbing fast. The young sailors scrambled to shut it down, but Carter's voice cut through the noise. Don't shut her down. Throttle back and hold it steady. The lieutenant hesitated. That's against protocol. I said hold it steady, Carter barked, his voice suddenly carrying the weight of command. Reluctantly, the throttle was eased instead of cut. Carter grabbed a thermal scanner from his satchel and moved toward the bearing housing. He felt the casing with the back of his hand, ignoring the rising heat warnings. This isn't a lubrication failure, he muttered. It's alignment. She's been sitting so long, the shafts shifted under her own weight. Can you fix it? The captain asked. Carter gave a small, wry smile. I've realigned shafts in 40-foot seas with seawater up to my ankles. I can fix this. For the next hour, he worked in the confined space, using shims and micrometer adjustments so fine they seemed almost absurd for machinery this massive. Sweat ran down his neck, his hands blackened with grease. The younger sailors fetched tools, wiped his hands, and watched as the turbine, their turbine, slowly came back into spec. When he finally stood, stretching his back, he gave a single nod. Try her again. This time, when the ignition sequence ran, there was no cough, no sputter. The deep, rising growl of the turbine filled the space, climbing into a steady, powerful roar. The deck vibrated beneath their boots. The overhead lights seemed brighter. Even the air smelled different, warmer, alive. Some of the sailors cheered. Others just stood in stunned silence. Carter rested a hand on the railing, closing his eyes for a moment. She's back, he said softly. The captain approached, offering his hand. Chief, you've just done what an entire engineering team couldn't. Carter shook his head. No, Captain. We did it. Her and me. And now we see if she can still dance. The next step would be the sea trial, a test run that would push the Arleigh Burke to her limits. For the crew, it was a chance to prove their ship still had a place in the fleet. For Carter, it was something more, a promise to a friend that had been kept. And as the ship prepared to leave the pier, no one knew that the trial ahead would test them all one last time, in a way none expected. The morning of the sea trial dawned clear and sharp, the fog burned away by a pale golden sun. The USS Arleigh Burke stood ready, her deck spotless, her crew in high spirits. Shore power had been disconnected. Lines were cast off. For the first time in months, the destroyer began to move under her own power, her wake curling white against the dark water. Chief Samuel Carter stood at the rail, the wind tugging at his jacket. His cap shadowed his eyes, but the faint smile on his face told the story. The kind of smile that belongs to someone seeing an old friend stand tall again. Down in the engine room, the turbines hummed strong and steady. The vibration through the deck was different now, not the uneven shiver of struggling machinery, but the deep, confident thrum of a ship ready for anything. The young sailors tended their stations with a new sense of pride. They weren't just running systems. They were guardians of a heartbeat that had been restored. As the Arleigh Burke cleared the breakwater, the captain's voice came over the 1MC, all hands, this is the captain. Today we see what this ship, and her people, are made of. Ahead 1/3. The turbines answered instantly, and the destroyer surged forward. Spray rose over her bow. The sea trial had begun. For the first hour, everything went perfectly. Speed tests, maneuvering drills, weapons system checks, all smooth, all sharp. Carter moved between the bridge and the engine room, listening, feeling, reading the ship like a language only he spoke. Then, without warning, a low alarm tone echoed in the engine room. A petty officer's face went pale. "Chief, cooling water pressure is dropping." Carter was at his side instantly. He scanned the readings, then glanced at the clock. They were running the turbines hard, higher loads than she'd handled in a long time. The strain was showing. The captain's voice came over the comm chief. "We've got 15 minutes left in the trial. Can she hold?" Carter didn't hesitate. "If I say no, we limp home. If I say yes, I'm with her every second until we're tied up again." The captain's reply was short. "Then stay with her." Carter worked fast, adjusting auxiliary pumps, balancing pressure between circuits, bleeding small amounts of air from the lines to stabilize flow. The younger sailors moved like an extension of his hands now. No skepticism, no doubt, just trust. The Arleigh Burke finished her final high-speed run with the sun glinting off her bow and the turbines roaring like they'd never been silent. As she throttled back and turned for home, the crew let out a cheer that rolled through the passageways like thunder. Back at the pier, families, dock workers, and even a few retired sailors had gathered to watch her return. They saw the ship moving under her own power again, her masts cutting clean lines against the sky. But they couldn't know the story of the man in the oil-stained jacket who had walked aboard just 2 days ago. When the ship tied up, the captain called all hands to the quarterdeck. 2 days ago, he began. This ship was a dead giant. Today, she's alive because of one man. A man who reminded us that experience, courage, and heart are worth more than any manual or machine. He turned to Carter. "Chief Samuel Carter, you've given this crew back their ship. And you've given me back my faith in something we sometimes forget, that the Navy isn't built on steel and technology alone. It's built on people." The crew broke into applause, some sailors shouting "Hoo-yah, Chief," over the noise. Carter, ever humble, just raised a hand to quiet them. "I didn't do it alone. This ship was waiting for someone to believe in her again. And you all did. You listened. You learned. And now you'll keep her alive." As the applause faded, the captain stepped forward with a small box in his hand. Inside was a challenge coin, the ship's coin, polished bright. From the crew of the USS Arleigh Burke, to the man who brought her back to life. Carter accepted it, but his eyes drifted to the ship behind him. "She's the one you should thank," he said softly. "She's the real hero." That night, as the sun sank into the horizon and the destroyer's lights glowed against the darkening sky, Carter walked down the pier alone. His satchel swung gently at his side. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he knew the Arleigh Burke didn't need him anymore. She was ready for her next watch. In the logbooks, the sea trial would be recorded as a technical success. But for those who were there, it was something more, a moment of military tribute. An inspirational military story of a forgotten hero who had shown what real battlefield courage looks like in peacetime. And for the young sailors who had once doubted him, it was the day they learned that sometimes the greatest heroic acts happen not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, stubborn fight to bring something, or someone, back to life.